The first patter of success felt almost anticlimactic. It was a tiny thing, an email delayed, a meeting postponed, but it left a hairline crack in Daniel's armor. I watched from the periphery as his composure wavered, a forced smile lengthened a little too long, a slight tremor when he tapped his fingers against a tabletop. People around him began to lean in, not because they cared, but because suspicion is a contagion and the social body loves a new story. I didn't celebrate. Celebration is loud, and loudness is dangerous. I sat in my apartment, listening to the muted sounds of the city, and catalogued the effect. The tiny disturbances propagated. Rumor found purchase. Rumor fed on itself and grew. If the first strike had been a pebble, the next moves were patient. Like athletes setting their muscles on a long, careful regimen. I cultivated new identities, a punctual volunteer at a charity gala, a friendly barista who remembered faces, a quiet man in a gym corner whose presence was easily overlooked. I fashioned them with the intent of being seen enough to be credible, not enough to be noticed. Each identity had a purpose. Each purpose was a tool. I bought a second phone, then a third. I opened new email accounts, social profiles, even a business card for a consultancy I had no intention of actually running. Technology makes lying elegant. It gives your falsehoods an air of legitimacy. I used it to build scaffolding around my silence. When Daniel began to snap under pressure, I leaned into the shape of an ally. I bumped into him at a cafe one rainy morning. He looked disheveled, the kind of exhausted that isn't cured by sleep. He recognized me, of course, we had worked together for years, but he didn't register anything more than a passing acquaintance. Rough month, I said, offering a small, non-committal smile. He exhaled and accepted the simple human exchange like a lost man grabbing the driftwood he finds in the tide. You have no idea, he replied. He was almost pleading for normalcy. I'm sorry, I said. Work can be unforgiving. He nodded, and for an instant he was a man whose mask had slipped. That was all I needed. Little slips, collected like coin, can be spent later when the price of ruin must be paid. But I did something else as well. I cultivated someone for Emily to see, not to replace her, but to unsettle her. Not with scandal, but with the quiet insinuation that life goes on without her. I began to frequent the cafe where she liked to read, sitting 2 tables away as she scrolled through her phone. I never stared. I simply existed in her periphery. People notice patterns more readily than they notice single actions. After months of being present, I became a background hum in her routine, an unremarkable constant. The goal was subtlety. The world is made fragile by accumulation. A slight shift of attention here, a small omission there, over time. The sum becomes significant. Emily began to look up more often, measuring the space around her. Her posture grew a fraction less relaxed. She took longer to laugh in public. She started sending shorter texts to Daniel. None of it was mine to celebrate, but each small fissure made the structure more interesting to dismantle. There were nights when my plan felt monstrous. I would look at my hands, ordinary and calloused from too many late-night coffees and the occasional restless walk, and I'd wonder about the shape of the person I was becoming. The man who revised spreadsheets at noon and planned sabotage at midnight. The man who can create an alibi with the same ease he prepares a good espresso. Still, I understood something important: cruelty is not always loud. The most devastating betrayals are the ones that leave no witnesses. That's why I worked in layers. Public embarrassments are theatrical, private collapses are surgical. I designed my moves accordingly. A month into the campaign, Daniel made a critical error. He sent an email, a braggadocious note meant for a small circle of confidants, to a much larger distribution list by mistake. The email contained off-the-record praise for cutting corners in a recent deal. A colleague forwarded it to HR with a brusque subject line. The rumor that had been simmering boiled over into formal inquiry. I had not touched that email. I had not planted it. But I had set the conditions for it to be found, for a casual observer to notice patterns and act. The truth is, manipulation is often a study of probabilities rather than precise strikes. You create the environment where your intended outcome becomes the most probable result, then you nudge it into being. As HR started their quiet inquiries, Daniel's friends recoiled. Some offered sympathetic texts, others clipped their tone into something colder. It was satisfying in a way that didn't feel like satisfaction. It was more like a lesson being proved. Meanwhile, Emily's cracks widened in a different direction. I began leaving small, anonymous gifts where she'd find them, a pressed forget-me-not in the pages of a book she was reading, a paper crane taped to the inside of her locker at the gym. Harmless, almost poetic. But the gifts forced her to notice the world as an unpredictable space. The gyre of safety she had relied on was subtly rearranged. She started checking the locks on her doors. She checked the faces of people in cafes a beat longer. She even changed the route she walked. Home by one cross street because the familiar no longer felt like sanctuary. The gifts did not scream vengeance. They whispered that the world had altered. That was the point. Fear is less effective. When it's loud, it works better when it creeps along the margins. Of course, not every plan moved exactly as I wanted. There were miscalculations. A voicemail I'd intended to be accidentally overheard was instead dismissed as someone's wrong number. A rumor that flickered briefly never caught flame. I logged each failure with the same impartiality I logged success. It was data. Data is honest, it tells you where to sharpen your approach. I also employed people, indirectly. A disgruntled temp at Daniel's office became the unwitting courier for a rumor I crafted. Because her resentment made her gullible. A barista at Emily's gym grew protective of a regular and told me things she thought were private. None of them suspected the larger architecture of my intentions. They were instruments played by a conductor who never lifted his baton into view. And then there were nights when I did nothing. Those were the hardest. The itch to act is a constant companion, but so is the knowledge that haste ruins masterpieces. I trained myself to cultivate patience like a hard-earned virtue. In silence, I learned to wait. Once, in the middle of all this, I sat across from a woman at a small, ill-lit restaurant. She was a stranger with kind eyes who asked about my work and listened when I talked of hobbies. For a moment, a different future, even if flimsy, flickered before me. I recognized the fragility of that flicker and let it pass. I could not be distracted. Not now. The campaign, when I finally admitted it to myself, had become my existence. It dictated my schedule, my moods, the way I dressed. It was not just about bringing them low, it was about proving that silence can be more devastating than a shout. I was shaping my life into a weapon too fine for a single use. It needed to be precise, as cold as the hinge of a well-made door. At the end of the third month, the changes were visible to anyone who looked. Daniel was cautious, thinner in his public gestures. Emily walked a breath tighter, keeping her phone close like a talisman. The couple still smiled in public, but it had the stiffness of a photograph mounted in haste, pretty, but lifeless. From a distance, that might have seemed like enough. But revenge, I realized, is not a single act. It's a litany. A ledger that tallies every slight, every stolen night, every lie. It is kept meticulously, and when the day to settle it comes, you pay with compound interest. I expanded my scope. I began to think of outcomes rather than acts. What would it mean for Daniel to lose everything he had imagined himself worthy of? What would it mean for Emily to understand, with bone-deep clarity, what true absence felt like? The answers were ugly and precise. But ugly and precise is the language of finished plans. The scaffold was taking shape. The patient hands of time were doing their work. And all the while, I remained quiet, an unremarkable man in the city's hum. Silent, patient, and exacting.